Hello everybody, welcome to week 13 of the course. Hope everybody's doing well. Okay, so last week we talked about the Cold War, right? Or we read and we watched videos about the Cold War. A couple things. I apologize for not making it clearer how you guys are supposed to access the videos. Usually if I post a video and there's not some sort of document in the files, that means that you can just Google search the video and find it on YouTube. It's publicly available. So that's an announcement for sort of here on out. Like for instance this week, JFK's inaugural address, you can find that on YouTube. So, but if you have any trouble with that, let me know. Okay. All right. So I've also added some comments on your discussions from last week about the Cold War and McCarthyism and Eisenhower's speech and things like that. So if you get a chance, take a look at those. I know we're getting sort of late in the semester and a lot of deadlines are coming up, but make sure that you're reading and watching the videos. It seemed like in some cases, the discussion posts may have been getting a little bit shorter, or some of the stuff seemed pretty big generalizations about the Cold War. So the material's good, it's interesting. So take the time to look at it and read it, because I think you'll find it interesting. Okay, enough of that. All right, so the question that I posed last week were what were the major threats identified in the PBS video about the file and McCarthyism, and some of the major threats that President Eisenhower posed in his farewell address. So, Cold War, right? We talked about last week. We talked about how World War I and World War II marked a radical departure in American foreign policy, right? From sort of sticking to our own affairs to actually, going out and being sort of this superpower and sort of taking control of the global stage, right? But of course, as we left it at the end of last week, we weren't the only major player left after the end of World War II, right? There were sort of two major powers standing. It was us and the Soviet Union, right? And even though we never engaged in all out sort of ground warfare against the Soviet Union, we were in many ways at war with them during that time. A lot of it through proxy wars like Vietnam or Afghanistan, right? And sort of this constant jockeying back and forth between the American way of life and the Soviet ideology. And I mean, that's why it's called the Cold War, of course, right? Because there were no, actual engagements between the Soviet Union and the United States, but it was a war that was sort of fought behind the scenes. If you guys haven't seen, there's a TV show out called The Americans that sort of it's about Soviet spies who are sort of implanted into American society. If you want to get a sense of, at least towards the end of the Cold War, what it was like, it's a great show. Anyway, so yeah, World War II is over. We have these two great powers standing. So, and it's not just a battle between two military powers. It's a battle between two competing ideologies, right? We have democracy, we'll say, in the United States, right? Our sort of libertarian way of life versus communism, right? The way of life that purportedly argues that everything belongs to the shared group. It's not an individual thing, it's a community thing, and it looks out supposedly more for the welfare of the general society. So we have these two sort of competing ideologies fighting it out after World War II, right? And because it was sort of they were the two major powers standing, they started acquiring, especially the Soviet Union started pressing their advantage, right? They started acquiring more territory. So that's when we sort of get into this, as Eisenhower talked about, this sort of domino theory thing, right? Like, they start taking power, and it looks like, the balance of power can tip towards the Soviet Union and towards communism, so we have to take action to step up. Okay, so with McCarthyism, right, he talked about, in this video how when you're engaged in a heated struggle, be it a war, even we can even look at 9/11 now, right, and sort of some of perhaps American sentiment towards Muslim Americans, right, how it sort of becomes this us versus them, and if you're not with us, if you're not patriotic enough, then maybe you're an enemy, right, and it led to a lot of paranoia during these times, especially considering both countries had nuclear capabilities, right? That was sort of, we had just ended World War II by dropping the bomb on Japan. So the specter of nuclear warfare and sort of mutually assured destruction was on everybody's mind. So this was a real fear, right? People were afraid. And, as we know, when people are afraid, it brings out the worst in human nature. So that's when, FBI files started popping up. McCarthy started accusing people of, being Soviet spies who were, academics, all sorts of crazy things going on. And, as the guy talked about in the file, he had virtually, he was a United States Marine. He had applied to serve in the Foreign Service. No legitimate grounds for this guy this guy to be under investigation, under scrutiny, right? But as we see time and time again in American history and human history, in times of crisis like World War II, like the Cold War, the government takes this power, right? So during the Cold War, the government really starts honing in on, watching its citizens, surveillance, right? We start surveilling our citizens more and more, right? Same thing, you look at 9/11. Right, the Patriot Act comes after 9/11, another catastrophe. Government takes more power. Now, ideally speaking, if the government takes more power, you would hope once the catastrophe sort of dissipates, that power would be sort of, given back to the people, right? It doesn't work that way. The power keeps accumulating over time, right? And that's how we've built up now into this massive surveillance state, right? And that is the threat that I was speaking of and that he was speaking of that is still ever present and growing with us today. With the advent of technology, right? Cameras on every corner, cell phones everywhere, everybody's on the internet, and you look at WikiLeaks, you look at what Snowden said, right? The government is capturing this information, right? And it's not just on potential terrorists, any information that you're putting out into the ether, somebody's listening to it or somebody's watching it. You can believe that. So this question of do we have privacy, and reasonable expectations to privacy, are in serious peril right now. So a major threat, and then it just got worse, after 9/11. So it's that balance between liberty and security, right? Do you how much liberty do you give up to be secure? And Franklin said, famously said that the person who's willing to give up liberty for security deserves neither, right? So how much liberty are we willing to cede in the name of so-called security, right? And as far as the paranoia and fear, obviously still with us, after 9/11, and the way that we look towards Muslim Americans. So yeah, that's a major threat that's still with us. One of the sort of legacies of the Cold War. So the second thing I wanted to talk about was Eisenhower, right? And Eisenhower's farewell address, which in my opinion is one of the greatest presidential addresses. I think it's amazing. So he seems like to me in a lot of ways one of the last great statesmen. He talks about the threat that we had, that we're facing during the Cold War, after World War II, and how, it is a threat, right? And the major shift that happened in this particular case was before World War I and World War II, there was no standing military, There was certainly no arms industry at the time. But because we were engaged in sort of this Cold War, this sort of, it seemed like fight to the death, who could win, this arms race as it became called, right? We had to be prepared. Otherwise we were afraid that the Soviet Union would take over, and our liberties would be encroached on, our way of life would be encroached on. So that led to this arms race, which kept building up the size of the military and the arms industry, right? And that's where he starts talking about the military-industrial complex, right? So certainly one concern was that the size of the military was growing, right? Which, going all the way back to the Revolutionary days, Samuel Adams talked about, even though he was a patriot, right? He talked about the dangers of establishing a standing army. He said, if you establish a standing army, it's very likely that the soldiers are going to start to see themselves as a body apart from the rest of the citizens, right? So that's just one consideration, and certainly with the decreasing amount of people who serve in the military now, we can see that there is the subcommunity of military veterans and soldiers very much apart from American society. But that's just back in his day, he was concerned about some sort of revolt. That's not the case today, right? But yeah, so no standing army before, for the most part. I mean, there have been isolated periods in American history where there have been, but for the most part, no standing army until sort of after World War II and the Cold War. And then the major kicker, the arms industry. He talked about in the video how, before American industries were able to, that were making plowshares, were able to make those plowshares into swords if we had to go to war. We mobilized our industries. But now we didn't have that luxury because we had to compete with the Soviet Union. So we created this massive arms industry. We are by far the leading exporter of arms and producer of arms in the world now. I think it's 25% maybe or something like that is produced by the United States, and 25% of all military exports, exported goods comes from the United States. And in addition to that, we spend I think it's about 4% of our GDP. And I think last year, if I'm correct, the defense industry was about $1.5 trillion. So extremely profitable. So, why is this a problem, right? Why does it become a problem that we have this sort of, first we have the standing army, and then we have, this industry that pops up to support that army, right? Well, if war becomes profitable, right, like it has been, $1.5 trillion is pretty profitable. I think the three top defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing, they make up 1% of our GDP, which is huge between three companies, massive. If war becomes profitable, how does that affect our policy decisions regarding when we go to war, right? If war is a major source of income for us, is that going to influence our politicians when we go to war, right? When we should be engaged in war? Is it a coincidence that since the institution of the military-industrial complex, that we seem to be sort of constantly involved in some sort of minor to major conflict, right, around the world, that we're the world's policemen, right? So, and of course these industries have significant political pull, right, through the use of political action committees and super PACs and things like that. Dick Cheney, vice president during Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom, was on the board of Halliburton. He had worked at Halliburton before, massive defense contractor, before coming back into office as vice president. So Cheney made a lot of money. He made a lot of money during Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom, and a lot of people made a lot of money during that time. So of course that was one of the major threats that he identified, and the one that's most famously associated with Eisenhower was this cautionary word about what role this military-industrial complex is going to play in figuring out when we go to war. And you can even look at the numbers, and you can see the amount of military conflicts that I think the Congressional Record Service has these numbers. You can see how many military conflicts we engaged in, the first half of the century. Look at how many we engaged in the second half of the century. Astronomically higher in the second half of the century. with the advent of the military-industrial complex. Obviously, it's a little bit more complicated than that. There are more factors. Correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, but it's a serious point to consider, as is sort of the growth of the surveillance state. Another interesting sort of cautionary thing that Eisenhower raised was the sort of rise of this technical expert specialization class, in America, right? How in order to really understand something, or to really, have an educated opinion on something, you need to have a PhD, a master's degree. You need to be a specialist in whatever this particular area is. And we see this all the time, right? We turn on the news, we look at debates about Iran, right, and Iran's nuclear program. They have all these experts that come on and talk about it, and that's great. But where does that leave the citizens? Where does that leave American citizens, the body of citizens? A lot of times we feel like we're spectators, right? We're spectators to what's going on, right? I think there's something that I read recently talking about, how democracy doesn't work, right? If we have policymakers, we have experts, and the rest of us are spectators, right? That's not a democracy. So yeah, this sort of perpetual specialization that's happened over the past 100 years really seems inimical, at least to sort of more ideas of participatory democracy. And you look at voter turnouts, right, and you see that things appear to be getting worse and worse, right? The millennial generation, which I would imagine most of you are part of, at least according to a most recent survey, is the least politically and religiously engaged generation, in American history. So what's going to happen to the political process, if people become more and more disengaged because they feel like, hey, I don't really have a say in this. What I'm going to do is not going to challenge things. And a lot of that goes back to what Eisenhower was talking about, with sort of this specialization within politics. So major challenges, and I think in a lot of ways what Eisenhower said was pretty prophetic. And of course the question becomes, what can we do about it, right? Is the genie out of the bottle, and is there any way to sort of put it back? Anyway, major shifts in American government, American political thought based on what the Cold War happened. Remember, sort of the increased surveillance, the rise of a standing army, and the military-industrial complex, and the rise of the specialists, and sort of, you could call it the alienation of American citizens from the political process. So yeah, interesting stuff. Okay, this week we're looking at civil rights. We're going to be reading Martin Luther King's famous letter. I'm going to have you guys watch JFK's inaugural address, which, as I said, you can find on YouTube or you can Google it. And we're looking at an essay on feminism, right? So anyway, I'll post the discussion question tomorrow. If you guys have any questions about your final paper, any questions about discussions, please feel free to shoot me an email. Have a good week.